Something was watching us. The story of what happened began in 2009, a year my family would never forget. Back then, we were a large family. My grandmother, with her 7-child, Ren, had built a rapidly growing dynasty. Each of her children had at least 2 kids, except for my aunt, who never had children, and my mother, who, only had me. In total, we were 11 grandchildren. Every year during the holidays, it was our tradition to gather and travel as a family. But our 2009 would be different. My uncle Alejandro, a man with an adventurous spirit, had bought a farm in a rural area with a warm and temperate climate. The farm seemed like something out of a dream, a white house on top of a small hill with 2 floors and balconies in every room, from which you could see the entire valley. At the bottom of the hill, there was a large parking area, and a little further away, a big, lonely 1-story house hidden among trees. The landscape was so beautiful that sometimes we felt as if we were in another world, one where time stood still. But what impressed me the most were the sounds. The whisper of the wind through the trees, the singing of geese and ducks in the small lake, the distant neighing of the horses. It was a place that, although seemingly perfect, had something in its stillness that I couldn't quite understand. Something I couldn't name, just like when a child feels fear but can't explain why. It's just instinct. My uncle Alejandro invited us to spend a few days at the farm. We were all excited. My cousins and I played and laughed nonstop. We swam in the pool, explored every corner of the property, and the fresh morning air was the perfect refuge for our endless games. Everything seemed idyllic, almost unreal, but after those days of fun, we had to return to the city. The children had to go back to school, and the adults to their jobs. My uncle, due to his commitments, couldn't be there all the time, so he decided to hire someone to take care of the farm and the animals in his absence. Mr. Ramon, a sturdy man with a deep voice, arrived with his wife, a woman with an expressionless face, and their 2 children, Esteban and Sara. Esteban, a boy of about 9 or 10 years old, had a sad look in his eyes as if good laughter had slipped away from him too quickly. Sara, his sister, was a mystery. Though she was about our age, her behavior was more like that someone much older, quiet, distant, lost in thoughts we couldn't understand. Mr. Ramon's family stayed at the farm whenever my uncle wasn't there. But when we or other guests arrived, they moved to a set of rooms my uncle had built especially for them, a place separate from the main house. Even so, we shared the kitchen and the rest of the farm, and although it was sometimes difficult to ignore the fleeting glances or the awkward silence of Mr. Ramon's wife, the adults acted kindly, as if everything was fine. For us children, it seemed like the perfect situation. So much freedom, so much space to play and explore. During that year's holiday season, when the whole family gathered at the farm again, we ran excitedly toward the pool, laughing and chatting. We invited Mr. Ramon's children to join us, but our response was less enthusiastic than we expected. Esteban was shy, but his eyes sparkled with the curiosity of someone who wanted to belong, but couldn't. Sara, on the other hand, she always seemed miles away, as if her body was at the farm, but her mind was elsewhere, in another time. Most of the day, we saw her sitting alone in a quiet corner or staring at the horizon. What unsettled me the most was the relationship between Sara and her mother. The woman was always cold and distant with us children. Never a smile, never an invitation to play. Her attitude was entirely different when she interacted with the adults. Then she became a charming, warm woman who made Rion laugh. But in the presence of children, her face would turn blank, as if she didn't know how to interact with us. It wasn't just my imagination. My mother and my aunts noticed it too, though they never spoke about it openly. Night came quickly, as it often does in remote places where the sun sets without a trace. We were exhausted, gathering in our rooms to sleep. Adults stayed outside on the terrace, surrounded by the murmurs of the night. They laughed, shared cold beers and snacks, but something in the air, something in the stillness of the farm made me uneasy. I, gripped by an inexplicable curiosity, got out of bed without knowing exactly why. I just felt an urgent need to get closer, to hear more. Maybe I wanted to ask my mother for something, but as I approached the balcony, something in the air made me stop. Instead of stepping forward, I stayed hidden in the shadows, unnoticed. That was when I heard the conversation. Mr. Ramon, with his deep voice, was talking to my Uncle Alejandro and the other adults. Something in his words made my skin crawl. Apparently, before our arrival, the farm had been rented out to a parish or a center that organized spiritual retreats. During of these retreats, a group of nuns and young novices, women preparing to enter the convent, had arrived, hoping to find peace and tranquility in that remote setting. But things hadn't gone as expected. Mr. Ramon recounted that the nuns hadn't even spent a single night at the farm. Just hours after arriving, they began packing their belongings in a hue, their desperation palpable. They rushed to the entrance and, between nervous whispers and hurried prayers, demanded to leave immediately. Mr. Ram, surprised, tried to stop them. He explained that the road to town was long and that he couldn't drive them, as his truck wasn't available at the T. But the women, visibly terrified, refused to stay another minute in that place. They called someone, though Mr. Ramon never knew who. The only he remembered was that, after hours of waiting, a young man arrived in a truck, the kind used to transport crops or livestock. The nuns climbed into the vehicle as if the ground beneath them was burning, afraid to touch any part of that land. At that moment, the Mother Superior approached Mr. Ramon, and before getting into the truck, told him something that left him paralyzed. "Leave this place. Your family is being watched." The weight of those words left Mr. Ramon speechless. He had never noticed anything strange in his family, though his eyes had been clouded by the route of tending the farm, and no one in the family had mentioned anything unusual. But that warning from the Mother Superior kept echoing in his mind. Anything didn't add up. And later, when our family arrived, things began happening that he could no longer ignore. My mother and my uncle's wife, Estrella, had noticed something strange about Mrs. Ramon's behavior, and her daughter, Sara. The way she looked at us, Ildren, that coldness, that detachment, and how Sara always seemed absent as if she lived in another world. It made them uneasy, and they decided to speak to Mr. Ramon, to share their concerns. That was when he started to remember, to connect the dots, and realize that something deeper, something darker was happening at the farm, something hidden until that moment. Then I heard Mr. Ramon ask the adults about some crosses. Crosses? What crosses? His face was tense with worry. He described finding crosses in difficult rent parts of the farm, some buried, others partially visible, as if they had been deliberately hidden. In places we had never noticed before, near the fountain, between the two houses, behind the hilltop house, among the trees, by the Jesus Lake, near the horse stable, even by the main entrance. Who had put them there, and why? A heavy silence settled over the night, as if something unseen was lurking in the shadows. Then, in a low, almost whispering voice, Mr. Ramon asked my Uncle Alejandro, "Has anyone else been here when we weren't? Has someone entered without us knowing?" My uncle, with a furrowed brow, shook his head, but there was a spark of doubt in his eyes. He didn't know how to respond because he, too, had noticed something strange. It wasn't just the presence of the crosses, but something in the air, something intangible and invisible, yet everyone could feel it. It was my mother who finally broke the silence, looking at Mr. Ramon with a serious, almost sorrowful expression. "That's not normal. We haven't placed crosses on the farm, and we hadn't seen them before, and now suddenly they appear. What's going on here?" But there were no answers. No one knew what to think. We only knew that something was out of place, something we couldn't comprehend. The next day, I was no longer myself. I couldn't behave normally after that conversation. My eyes wandered everywhere. I needed to confirm the presence of the crosses. I managed to find the ones in the garden, the one among the trees near the lake, and the one behind the main house. They were very rudimentary crosses made of branches with a very dark hue, almost ebony, tied together with twine or some type of rope. I couldn't bring myself to approach them. Something told me I shouldn't touch them, but at least now I knew they were real. That same night, the air was thick and heavy, as if the darkness itself were breathing over us. Outside, the adults continued searching with their flashlights for something no one could see. Whispers and uneasy glances as they tried to decipher the source of a noise that had broken the night's silence. On the farm. I watched from the half-open door, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw her. Sara. She passed in front of us without making a sound, as if floating in the shadows. Her dark hair was tied in a braid. I could see that her gaze was fixed, on a point beyond, a destination invisible to everyone except her. She walked with unsettling confidence, without hesitation, without even glancing at Saf. Tias, why is she going to the lake? My little cousin Andres whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer. It didn't make sense. It was too late. The night was dense. The farm was immersed in almost complete darkness. And yet, Ara walked as if she knew every inch of the ground beneath her feet, as if something were guiding her. My eyes instinctively turned to Mr. Ramon's wife. She remained standing at the doorway, holding her flashlight unlit in her hands. She made no move to stop her daughter. She didn't call out to her, didn't try to follow her. She just stood there, motionless. And the most terrifying thing was her expression. There was no fear in her eyes, no concern, only resignation. A chill ran down my spine. My body urged me to act, to call her name, to run after her, but something I couldn't explain, kept me anchored to the ground, as if interfering would be a mistake. I'm going to tell my mom, I whispered, and without waiting for an answer, I ran upstairs. My mother was lying down, but when I told her what I had seen, her expression changed immediately. She got up and said she would go tell Mr. Ramon. I clung to her arm as I followed her, but I never knew if she actually did. The next morning, breakfast at the farm took place in tense silence. Amid the clinking of cutlery and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, I heard something that made me shudder. Someone would come to take care of the crosses. My uncle Alejandro said it with firm resolve, as if it were the only possible solution. His wife Estrella looked at him with reproach and concern. My mother and my aunt simply averted their gazes and continued eating, avoiding the topic. I, on the other hand, felt immense helplessness. It seemed I was the only child who couldn't ignore what was happening on the farm. My little cousins remained silent, avoiding any contact with Ramon's family, and Sarah, I never saw her again. Her absence also unsettled my mother, who asked Ramon's wife about her daughter. The woman responded with a kind, serene smile. She's sick, but she's recovering. As she spoke, she took my mother's hands in hers with a tenderness that made no sense. She seemed so genuine, so empathetic. But when I looked closely, I knew she was lying. The truth wasn't in her smile, it was in her eyes. You always have to look at people's eyes. That's where their real thoughts. The next day, we left the farm and went to the town. We needed a distraction to get away from that suffocating atmosphere. We walked through the plaza, visited the church, and bought some traditional pastries. For the first time in days, everything seemed fine. But when we returned, night had already fallen over the farm, and the first thing we noticed was the light on in the house on the plain. Ramon and his family left this morning for his parents' house, my uncle Alejandro said, frowning. No one should be here. We stopped in front of the house, staring at that single illuminated window in the darkness. Ramon must have forgotten to turn off the light, he tried to reassure us. Without hesitation, he walked towards the house, determined to check that everything was in order. My Aunt Carla, for some reason, took out her camera and snapped a picture of the scene. Minutes passed before my uncle returned. There's nothing strange, just a light left on, he said naturally, as if there was nothing to worry about. But my aunt didn't reply. She was staring at her camera screen, her expression turning to pure horror. "Oh my God!" my mother whispered, covering her mouth with a hand. I moved closer, trying to see what they were looking at. In the photo, in the lit window, there was a clear silhouette of a man, or something resembling a man. He was sitting sideways, his profile barely outlined by the light. But the most disturbing thing was his abdomen. It protruded unnaturally, stuck, fallen, or deformed. Silence fell over us. My uncle Alejandro checked the image and shook his head. There was no one there. I went in, I checked every room. There was no one. But the image didn't lie. Fear took hold of the adults. They grabbed our hands and hurried us into the main house. That night, no one slept alone. He pulled mattresses onto the floor, brought blankets and pillows, and we all stayed in the same room, with the lights on and the adults keeping watch. No one mentioned the photo. No one spoke of the shadow in the window, and I don't know why we simply didn't leave that very night. By morning, the decision had been made. They woke us before dawn. Everything was packed and ready. We had a quick breakfast, and without looking back, we left the farm. The journey back to the city was long and silent, but once home, everything seemed to return to normal, or so we thought. A few days later, my Aunt Carla was reviewing the photos she had taken during the trip. She connected her camera to the TV to project them. Only she, my mother, and I were in the room watching the screen. The first images were normal, us playing, exploring, laughing at the farm. But then something changed. Spots appeared in the photos, circles, some dark, others whitish, like shadows floating in the air. At first we thought it was a camera glitch, but as we kept looking, the spots became clearer. If you stopped and looked closely, if you got close enough, you could see human features in them. Eyes, mouths open in anguish, figures that hadn't been there when the photos were taken. My Aunt Carla turned off the screen immediately. A year later, my uncle put the farm up for sale. It wasn't easy to sell. More than a year passed before someone showed interest. And during that time, more things happened. But that's another story. The truth is, we never found out what really happened. What were those crosses? What was that figure in the window? And what were those dark and white spheres?